the summer of 1989, where you were poised to witness history as we know it. But first, tell us a little bit more about where you teach.
I teach in England at De Montfort University in Leicester, and also I've been asked to teach in Shanghai at Fudan University. I have also a number of more short-term invitations to a number of universities. And of course, I'm also very much interested in financial markets. I'm an UK regulated asset manager. I've run global macro funds, including for Bear Stearns Asset Management. I'm, for the last few years, essentially, my hobby has been to set up community banks in the UK.
We will talk more about that because you do have another book out there that is not Princess of the Yen, where you explore deeply what happened in the United Kingdom with its property markets, with its banking system. And we'll get to that because I think there are probably many parallels to be drawn. But first, let's take a walk back in time. You hear the anecdotes, Pebble Beach and all of the trophy properties and the massive outflow of money that left Tokyo, and the Imperial Palace was worth as much as the state of California. You hear these things, but it's impossible to put them in your mind if you weren't there, but you were there. What was it like? You were there before the bubble burst. And what took you there?
That's true. Well, what took me there was that I couldn't go to China, to Shanghai, to Fudan University, because I had a place there to learn Chinese. It was a bit ahead of things at the time, because it was still, the Iron Curtain hadn't fallen. But I thought China's going to rise and I want to learn Chinese. But it wasn't possible suddenly in '89 for various reasons. If you go back, martial law declared and things like that. I went to Tokyo initially for Deutsche Bank, and that was in the summer of 1989, at the peak of the Japanese legendary gigantic stock market bubble. Saw that at close range. In the end, just so you see where this was then leading, I ended up staying in Japan for quite a while, in total 12 years. Various doors open. I was at the University of Tokyo. I was the first Shimomura Fellow at the Japan Development Bank, one of the government banks that had been involved in the high growth era in Japan, establishing post-war recovery and very high growth for several decades. And then I was at the Bank of Japan. That's why I had my introduction into central banking. What was it like in '89? Well, one important feature is, if you think back, nobody called it a bubble at the time. It wasn't considered a bubble. It was just, that's the situation. That's the level of stock prices and land prices. It's Japan. And remember the stories, how Japan was going to take over the world, and it's going to be the next 21st century is going to be the Japanese century. Japanese money had been flooding out of the country across the world in the 1980s. And of course, people tend to extrapolate from these past trends, and then it was just all the way up for Japan. But that was clearly not going to happen. And I just come back from Japan in '91. The stock market had fallen quite a bit, down by almost by over 20%, 30%, approaching 50%. So big falls. But the economy was still expanding. GDP growth was 7%, 7%. Interest rates were around 7% as well. Short rates, long rates. And so what was everyone saying? Well, the Bank of Japan came out in '91 and was saying, okay, we're going to lower interest rates. And so for everyone, just based on the standard analysis, all the strategies were coming out, and we're saying, well, buy Japanese stocks because, well, the economy is clearly strong. We know Japan's strong, good fundamentals, companies are strong. The stock market has fallen so much, and now they're lowering rates. And of course, the traditional standard analysis, conventional analysis is if you've got lower interest rates, that's good for the economy, it's good for stock markets. that's what they're doing. And they had a long way to lower them, which they did follow. Now that's the moment my first paper was published back at Oxford when I just come back in September, October 91. And my conclusion was the opposite, namely, and also remember, at the time, the top 20 banks in the world were all Japanese banks by assets, these huge balance sheets. And my conclusion was, don't buy Japanese stocks. Japanese banks are likely to go bankrupt, and Japan is likely to move into the biggest recession since the Great Depression. That was sort of written up in The Economist. I had the job offers, went back to Tokyo then in 93, started as chief economist, early 94, with the British firm Jardine Fleming Securities, since it's been bought up by JP Morgan. And my thesis was that essentially what has created the bubble was switching into reverse and was going to crush the banking system. But for a long time, people thought this can't be true, it's impossible. And I was really amazed by how long people hung on to the old story of the great Japan and the economy is going to be strong. It's just a small dip, and the fundamentals are so strong. To me, it was quite obvious. And I guess we should talk about the mechanism I saw behind this, because that really taught me about how economies everywhere work. It's the banking system, and how central banks really interact there with the banking system, and how the credit mechanism in the banking system is the core mechanism. And all that was all contracting. I put out an estimate in the early 90s of the size of the bad debts I was expecting in the banking system. Now, in those days, people had tiny forecasts of bad debts. It wasn't really a topic, bad debts in the banking system. And my forecast was, well, it's going to be in percentages around 25% of bank balance sheets.
Wow.
Which also made it, approximately similar percentage of GDP, 1 year's annual GDP. So substantial, because we know capital is usually 10% or less. For the bigger banks, less than 10%. So certainly anything above 10% in bad debts is the end of the banking system, really.
That's insolvency.
Exactly. Now, ironically, by the end of the decade of the 1990s, everyone had become so negative on Japan. They had bad debt estimates which were much larger than my original ones from the early 90s. And then I was told, this is wildly too large. But by the end, the consensus had become so negative. But if you go back and actually check the figures, my original figures were the correct ones. It was around 80 trillion